All right, let's look at converting fractions and decimals. To do that, to switch a fraction to a decimal, I brought back a decimal place value chart, and that goes all the way back to the beginning of the year. I think you remember when I pulled out my chainsaw. Poor Oliver in the morning, poor Lucas in the afternoon. We took that one whole and we cut them into 10 equal pieces, that's tenths. And then we cut them again into 100 equal pieces, which was the hundredths. So instead of making them 10 times bigger, like we did going to the left here, we made them 10 times smaller. And when we're talking about fractions being a way to do division, you're dividing and making them into smaller pieces like we are in decimals. We make them 10 times smaller. So just a quick reminder of this. Now in this math lesson, you're going to take a fraction like 1/10, and you're going to have to tell me what decimal that's equivalent to. And so when you say this fraction 1/10, you're saying actually the decimal that it's equivalent to. 0 whole, and that's this ones place, and there's our decimal point there, 1 in the tenths place. So 1/10 is equivalent to 1 in the tenths place. And we could also look at hundreds. You might get a fraction like 45 hundredths. Well, 45 hundredths as a fraction is the same as, there's not a whole number, so we're going to put our 0 here. There's no ones place. And there's our decimal point, 45. But notice the 5 is in the hundredths place. The 4 is in the tenths. The 5 is in the hundredths. So you're going to take a fraction and change it into a decimal. Now here's the good news. All of our fractions will have tens and hundredths in them. So it's really simple if you remember this place value. If it's in the tenths, it's the first place behind the decimal, to the right of the decimal. And if it's in the hundreds, it finishes in the second place behind the decimal. So for instance, 45 hundredths goes all the way to the hundredths place. One problem that can be kind of confusing is something like 7 hundredths. That one's a little tricky because there's still no whole. We didn't have a whole. A whole would have to be 100 out of 100. And we're way far away from that. But we also don't have anything in the tenths place. But we do have 7 in the hundredths place. Now if it were 17, we'd have 1 in the tenths place. If it were 37, we'd have 3 in the tenths place. But there's nothing here in the tenths place, so there's nothing here in the tenths place. The only thing we have is 7 in the hundredths place. 7 hundredths, 7 hundredths. Let's take a look at a couple of your splash math problems you're going to see today and see how this all ties in. So a few more examples here. We've got 3/10. We need to change that. I'm going to switch that to a fraction that's equivalent to that. And this equal fraction could be 30 hundredths. And I want to remind you, equal fractions, we spent a lot of time on this at the beginning of our break in March and beginning of April there. How we make equivalent fractions. Whatever we do to the numerator, we have to do to the denominator. And you're going to see right here, we made that 3 10 times bigger. And I know it's 10 times bigger because 3 times 10 is 30. To make it equivalent, the denominator has to be 10 times bigger. Here's how we're making them equivalent, doing the same to the numerator that we're doing to the denominator. And 10 times 10 is 100. You're going to see lots of patterns with tenths and hundredths. Right? And to show you the decimal will look the exact same. There's 3/10. Notice the 3 is in the tenths place. Here's 30 hundredths. Notice we didn't change much, we just threw a 0 on here. Doesn't change the number, they're still equivalent, but you can add that 0 here and have them still be equivalent. So 3/10, 30 hundredths. You can also go from hundredths to tenths. And let's see what happened here. This time, I divided by 10. To go from 40 to 4, that's 10 times smaller, or 40 divided by 10 is 4. To make them equivalent, I'd have to divide the denominator by 10. And 100 divided by 10 is 10. So 40 hundredths is the same as 4 tenths. You'll notice the difference is we just took off a 0 off of both the numerator and denominator. When you divide by 10, you're just making it 10 times smaller, which is dropping that 0. Let me show you what the decimals look like for this one. Here's 40 hundredths, and here's 4 tenths. Notice that they are the same amount. This is like 40 pennies, and this is like 4 dimes. It's worth the same amount. They're just naming it a little bit differently, going to the hundredths or pennies, and 4 dimes or 4 tenths. Let's see some more examples. All right, so here's a fraction. They're going to want you to find the equivalent. So if I'm looking at this, I know 10 times 10 is 100. Then I want to know what times 10 equals 40. Again, times 10 to make it equivalent, do the both to the numerator and denominator. What times 10 is 40? Well, 4 times 10 is 40. This one I love. They're going to have you draw 6 tenths, but what they gave you, just to test you out, is they gave you the hundredths. So normally tenths go in rows like this. This is 1/10 right here. But they pulled that chainsaw out. They didn't just cut them up and down like this. They cut them side to side as well to make hundredths. But 6 tenths, if you wanted to make it equivalent to hundredths, would be 60 hundredths. And I know that because the numerator is times 10 and the denominator is times 10, and they're equivalent, so it's going to be the same thing. So if I had to model this, show this, I would have to color in 60 of these squares. I'm going to go ahead and color 10, 20, 30, here comes 40, 50, and 60 hundredths. And here's another example. Now they're talking mixed numbers. So 8 tenths is equivalent to 80 hundredths. What whole number is equivalent to 1? Well, this one's super easy. 1. The only thing I changed, these are equivalent, is instead of 8 tenths, I'm doing 80 hundredths. Other than that, it's the same thing. All right, this time they've got their mixed numbers again. They kept the whole number the same. 2 is equivalent to 2. But how many tenths is equivalent to 10 hundredths? So I'm going to look at it this way. I'm dividing by 10. So 100 divided by 10 is 10. Then what's 10 divided by 10? 10 divided by 10 is 1. So 1/10 is equivalent to 10 hundredths. And here it is in word form, same idea. How many tenths is equal to 50 hundredths? Well, I'm going to show you a couple different ways. You can look at it as a decimal. 50 hundredths. This is, remember, ones, tenths, hundredths, 50 hundredths. I could also write it as this decimal. Same thing, 5 tenths. The only difference is this one has a 0 here. So 50 pennies, 5 dimes. How many tenths? 5 tenths. Now it's 3 tenths. This time I'm going to show it to you as a fraction, because fractions and decimals are equivalent, or you can convert back and forth between the two. If I have 3 tenths, how many hundredths would that be? Well, I know 10 times 10 gives you that denominator of 100. To make it equivalent, I've got to do the numerator by 10, which would be 30 hundredths. Let's look at one more example here. They're giving us hundredths here, but they gave us a picture of the tenths. So I've got to convert this 10 hundredths into tenths. So I'm going from 100 down to 10. I'm dividing it 10 times, making that 10 times smaller. So 100 divided by 10 is 10. I've also got to do the same to the numerator. 10 divided by 10 is 1. So all I would have to do for this one is color in this 1/10. Give it a try, guys. Make sure you watch that Math Antics video as well. It'll give some more description. But give it a try. Only one splash math lesson today. Good luck.